Meghan Markle comes under fire over Princess Diana, Prince William wants to change the monarchy, and Queen Camilla pays tribute to a favoured author. I'm Jack Royston, Newsweek's chief royal correspondent, and this is Newsweek's Royal Report. Hello listeners and welcome to the show. Now, Meghan has been at Paris Fashion Week on Saturday, in fact, and in the evening she posted a little clip on social media which she probably thought was completely innocuous, and of course it immediately blew up and created a backlash against her, as is so often the case with Meghan and Harry. Now, this particular piece of footage was just her sat on the backseat of a car. She was being driven alongside the River Seine in Paris, past a kind of famous and picturesque bridge called the Pont Alexander III. And it's been suggested that this was what it was within a mile of the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, which is where Princess Diana died in a car crash in 1997. So there was a backlash that blew up first on social media, on Twitter, where one person suggested this was kind of insensitive and maybe even intended to trigger Harry, particularly inflammatory allegation there, but it wound up on the front page of the Daily Mail, which is, I think, now pretty much, if not actually, Britain's biggest selling national newspaper, and also the tabloid that Harry and Meghan hate more than any other. So obviously, very clearly, huge emotions on both sides here, and a very kind of high stakes argument developing between the two sides. Against the backdrop of this argument, there's also a court case which Harry's filed against the Mail, which is going to trial in January. But first of all, I just want to tell you a little bit about what the different people involved in this story are saying. So to start with, a source I spoke to said this: the Daily Mail throwing out a line about insensitivity is a bit rich. They have chosen, at a complete stretch I might add, to draw the most tenuous link between an Instagram post and the death of Harry's mother. That, for me, is the insensitive bit. So without putting too fine a point on it, obviously, I think the point being made there is that Diana died while she was being pursued by paparazzi photographers who were trying to get photographs to sell to the British tabloid press. Now, the tabloids, including the Daily Mail, others too, the Sun, News of the World, other newspapers as well, but certainly including the Daily Mail, had been paying huge amounts of money for pictures of Diana at the time. And if she had not been trying to escape those photographers, it is very unlikely that she would have lost her life that day. So this really goes to the heart of, a tragedy and an event that hugely shaped Harry's whole life. He was 12 years old when Diana died. And so from his point of view, this is one of the very newspapers that he would blame for his mother's death, now accusing his wife of being insensitive. And bear in mind, Harry has said over the years that he's worried that history will repeat itself, that, Meghan, having been kind of relentlessly trolled by the British media, she's had suicidal thoughts at points. Back in 2019, she experienced suicidal thoughts while pregnant. And so Harry has said before that, he's been worried that newspapers will force Meghan into doing something that will mean her story ends just as tragically as his mother's did. So you can't really get, Harry and Meghan, they hate the Mail anyway. And then this is speaking to perhaps the most kind of traumatic and difficult episode in Harry's entire life. Like I said, it all started on social media. The particular Twitter post was viewed more than 500,000 times, so huge audience, and it said, "Let's drive by the Pont de l'Alma tunnel just to trigger H, because that's what I do." So that's kind of like ventriloquizing for Meghan, imagining that that's her motivation. So that's obviously also particularly controversial. My source says, that's an outrageous and ridiculous thing to say. The Daily Mail headline read, "Meghan Markle savaged for utterly bewildering Instagram video as she's driven past Diana crash tunnel with feet on the seat, and royal expert suggests Harry could take a dim view." That I'm specifically told that there's a huge objection basically to any suggestion that Meghan was involved in some kind of Machiavellian attempt to either upset or trigger Harry or anything else, and that Meghan didn't actually know how close she was to the Pont de l'Alma tunnel at the time. And that basically, from her point of view, she'd had a good night. She was being driven in the backseat of a car by some very picturesque, Parisian skyline. The nighttime, the river, the street lights, it all looked fantastic. So she just poked her phone up to the window, did a little video, posted it on Instagram. Then next thing you know, it's on the front page of the Daily Mail. So honestly, I kind of do have a little bit of sympathy here with Meghan because she is ultimately doing what any tourist might do. Like, you can always have a debate about whether you like Harry and Meghan or you don't like Harry and Meghan. And honestly, make your own minds up. I'm not here to tell people what to think. I'm here to provide analysis. I'm here to provide my perspective, but I don't have any real desire to control other people's perspectives or opinions. So if you like Harry and Meghan, then crack on. If you hate Harry and Meghan, then that's your decision. But honestly, if you step back and dispassionately look at what Meghan actually did, it is something that any tourist might have done. Um, but actually, I think there's also something really interesting going on here, which is that, the Daily Mail did this and haven't actually faced a huge backlash in Britain, which shows just how much public opinion I think has changed over the years. So once upon a time, the tabloids were so firmly established as the villains of both William and Harry's story that there was no way you could get so much as like a cigarette paper between Harry and William, and the British public over, the question of their mother's death and who was to blame for it. The whole country interpreted that it was the paparazzi's fault and it was the fault of the British tabloids for encouraging them. In fact, I remember back in 2017, so early days of Harry and Meghan's relationship. It was the 20th anniversary of Diana's death, and William and Harry did these big interviews with British TV documentaries. They sat down, they talked about Diana's death for the first time, they talked about their grief, and they talked about the fact that the British press played a part in her death, and it was very, very clear during those documentaries who the villains of the story were. And none of those tabloid newspapers would have dared at that time say anything that kind of picked a fight with Harry and William over the memory of their mother. Like, it would have been inconceivable. And it's a kind of weird thing that's happened. Those were blockbuster documentaries seen by everybody, massively reported on by the tabloids, front page splashes all round, huge amounts of coverage. And it's like a weird byproduct of the rift between Harry and William that it's enabled the public and therefore the media too to kind of perceive the existence of this position, which is them backing William over Harry in relation to their mother, Diana. So that was never a thing. Like, Harry and William, back in the days when they were seen as this kind of inseparable unit, you could never have a situation where the media could try to leverage an idea that they're preserving, like the kind of reputation or image of Diana for William against Harry. Like, that would have been completely inconceivable. And so, through this kind of moment of prestidigitation or like kind of illusion, they can kind of conjure this position that like Meghan is the villain, just like ignoring Harry's perspective on it in his view of his own mother, and ignoring the newspaper's past role in kind of paparazzi chasing Diana, because of the breakdown in the relationship between the two brothers. Like, if that ultimately is the reason why this story is able to happen without a backlash against Harry, it's because of the fact that his relationship with his brother broke down, sides were taken, the British press sided with William, and the British public largely sided with William as well against Harry and Meghan. And therefore, in relation to this story that's so close to the bone for Harry, it's now much harder for him to kind of go out and say, well, the press are being abusive. This newspaper that I hate is being abusive towards my wife. And the reason is because something about the whole Sussex position has crumbled over many, many years. I'm not, like I said, here to tell people what to think. And if you hate Harry and Meghan, that's your choice. If you love Harry and Meghan, that's your choice. I'm not here to try and tell people which side of the fence they should be on. But I just think that if the Mail had done this back in 2017, it would have been pitchforks at dawn. The British public would have been genuinely really, really angry about it. And it's really striking and startling to me to see how far that has changed. Once upon a time, during the I suppose that 2017 anniversary, it wasn't that long after the Leveson inquiry. I mean, I guess it was a few years. 2011 was a big moment in it. But still, like, the world is an unrecognizable place now. So it's easy for me to understand why Harry would want to really kind of like double down on that point of view. and double down on his, his perception of the press as being the villains. But it's just crazy to me that he doesn't get that automatic traction anymore. He doesn't get that kind of automatic direct line to British public opinion, and that the Mail can do something that they would never have countenanced years ago. And like I said, there's that lawsuit in the background as well. Like, my source tells me, the lens that Harry's camp are basically viewing this through is the lawsuit that Harry filed against the Mail. So he's got, coming up in January, a trial where he's going to have to give live evidence against this newspaper that's done this thing that he will consider very upsetting. And the perspective, and it completely chimes with all the past things that Harry has said about all his other lawsuits, that he feels that some of these newspapers do this kind of thing to him and write these kinds of stories about him because he sued them. That it's a strange mixture of perhaps revenge and an effort to silence him, to keep him quiet and stop him attacking them. So that court case is about historic allegations of phone hacking and other associated unlawful activity. The newspaper obviously vehemently denies it all and will seek to try to defend itself in court and get it all thrown out. But like I said, the atmosphere in 2017 was totally different, and it's all changed. And it's an example of a point that I think I've tried to make on this podcast before, which is that basically you have the foundations of a public figure's relationship with their audience, with the public, with everybody, basically, is their popularity. The popularity is the prerequisite that allows everything else to happen. So if you want to go and you want to be a campaigner, whether it's for social justice or for anything else, you want to go, you need to be able to speak to people. You need to have their ear. They need to care what you think. And once upon a time, Harry and Meghan really were hugely influential in the sense that people loved the people that they loved, hated the people that they hated. And I think, there probably was a degree of fear among a lot of journalists in the media about what Harry and Meghan might want to say about them or about the publications they worked for and how that they might experience or feel about that. But I think a lot of that power that Harry and Meghan had has disintegrated because basically they overused that position. They did too much criticizing actually Harry's family rather. I don't think it was the criticisms of the media that did it, but the kind of relentless criticisms of Harry's family caused a break, actually on both sides of the Atlantic, with the British public and the American public, in their relationship with their audience. And people got to a point where they just didn't feel like they could keep going with it anymore. And so if Harry and Meghan want to be in a position where they can kind of take the fight to the Mail on stories like this, then what they really need to do first is to rebuild that relationship with the public. And a lot of what I'm seeing is them taking steps in the right direction. So actually, Meghan going to Paris Fashion Week, I think, is a great step in that project. And I think she looked fantastic. She wore 2 different outfits. She was there for the Balenciaga show. One was all in black, the other was all in white. I think she looked stunning, and so that's all great. I have absolutely no problem with that. And Harry's visit to Britain not that long ago went really well. He saw his charities, he looked happy, he looked positive, he looked confident. He saw his father. That will stand him in good stead. So a lot of these things are, I think, steps in the right direction for them. I think that they probably are not at a point yet where they have regained enough public support and public trust to make much inroads in kind of taking the battle to the media. Which is not me saying that, they shouldn't feel upset about these things, or even that they should never say anything about it. I don't necessarily have too much of a problem with them doing it, but I think they need to know and understand themselves that they probably won't be hugely successful at persuading the public to change their minds, probably for years, until they've done significant work to just rebuild the foundations of their relationship with the public. And with Meghan, a lot of what she's been doing recently is her lifestyle show, as ever is the online shop, and With Love Meghan is the Netflix show. And I think the shop could actually be a winner for her financially. I think that the Netflix show is probably a little bit too vanilla and a little too safe for her to get a huge amount of audience out of it. So it'll probably wind up being something that kind of slips into the annals of history in time. Fashion, I think, is probably a much better bet for her. So I think coming to Paris Fashion Week is a great thing. She spoke to Anna Wintour. They were kind of filmed, kind of like having a little chat together. That's a good, solid connection. Somebody British as well who isn't allergic to Meghan, so that's useful for them. So a lot of the stuff they're doing, it's the right thing, but they are like the cold hard reality of it is that they're in this position where they are going to have to suck up some really difficult stuff for a period of time, at least. And I spoke last week on the podcast about how, Harry become angry, I think, at some of the leaks coming out the palace to the British press, which had, framed him as having been upset that his meeting with his father was too formal, and he didn't think that wasn't how he felt. Basically, he didn't feel that way. The stories weren't true; they weren't correct. But this, the sad reality from Harry's point of view is he is going to have to suck up some of this stuff, and Meghan too, because they're at, like, once upon a time they could strike fear into the hearts of British newspapers, but they haven't sufficiently rebuilt with their relationship with the public in either Britain or America to do that again. So no matter how difficult some of these experiences might be, really, I think they need to keep their eyes on the prize, and that prize is just to keep, continuing to detoxify their image, and rebuild. Like, for me, they're still in the rebuild phase where they have to keep focused on the overarching goal of trying to find new things for people to love about them, to be interested in them for, and particularly cultural spaces that they can occupy that aren't controversial. And that's the key thing about her going to Paris Fashion Week in the first place, is that it's a non-controversial cultural conversation, or at least it should be. You can, that's the goal. Balenciaga, obviously a hugely controversial brand in really very recent years, but the fashion industry seems to have forgiven them. So, and I saw very little backlash about Meghan working with Balenciaga. So I don't think that choice of brand is going to do her any harm. But look, Harry now looks ahead to the lawsuit coming in January, and everything I'm hearing on both sides is that's not going to get settled out of court. He sued Rupert Murdoch's media empire on similar allegations, and that did get settled out of court for a huge sum of money. Everything I'm hearing is that this is heading for trial. It's not going to be settled, and that means he's going to be giving evidence, and it's going to be a messy, messy lawsuit. So it's probably going to be, in many ways, the most interesting of all of Harry's. But I could not sitting here now honestly tell you who's going to win. I think Harry has a really good chance of getting some of his allegations over the line, but I think there's an equally good chance that some of the most explosive allegations will not wind up being proven in court. But I think there's a good chance that he'll prove something called blagging, which is a practice that used to be big in journalism in Britain, where people would kind of like call I think one of the examples was they got hold of Kate's mobile number by calling her phone company, no doubt pretending to be her or somebody in her family, and they managed to trick somebody into giving them the information they were looking for, which was a mobile phone number. So I suspect that some of that kind of stuff might sneak over the line, but it's anybody's guess from my point of view whether he wins on the biggest, most high-profile allegations that he wants to make. Just a reminder to rate and review The Royal Report on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your favourite shows.
I want to create a world in which my son is proud of what we do, in a world and a job that actually does impact people's lives for the better. That is caveated with, I hope we don't go back to some of the practices in the past that Harry and I had to grow up in. And I'll do everything I can to make sure we don't regress in that situation.
It sounds like the monarchy will be shifting in a slightly different direction.
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda.
Prince William has done a big interview with the Canadian actor Eugene Levy for his Apple TV show, The Reluctant Traveller. So the idea of the show is basically that Levy is trying to tick stuff off his bucket list. So, he's not much of a traveller, but he's learning to be, and so he wants to go around the world doing incredible, amazing things. And so one of those things is going to Windsor Castle, hanging out with Prince William, getting the guided tour. learning a bit about the monarchy and kind of doing that American tourist thing of going to Windsor to see the castle in, I suppose, the most glamorous way possible by having an actual tour from the future king himself. I think William came across really well. He often does in these kinds of interviews where it's like a soft interview. There's not going to be a grilling, there's not going to be any hardball questions. It's more about the kind of interpersonal interaction between him and Eugene Levy. He's done this kind of stuff with English footballers, soccer players in the past, and he does usually come across as quite kind of like soft-natured and warm and personable in these kinds of things. But he also, in this particular interview, touched on some big picture kind of issues as well. And that's probably the most interesting part of it from a royal reporting perspective. So he talked about wanting to change the monarchy. I'm going to read you some of his quotes. So he says, "Change is on my agenda, change for the good." He says, I want to question things more. I want to create a world in which my son is proud of what we do, a world and a job that actually does impact people's lives for the better. I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me, is the idea of being able to bring some change. Not overly radical change, but changes that I think that need to happen. I think it's very important that tradition stays, and tradition has a huge part in all of this. But there's also points where you look at tradition and go, is that still fit for purpose today? Is that still the right thing to do? Are we still doing and having the most impact we could be having? So that's a really interesting run of quotes for a number of reasons. So one, he talks a little bit about impact and how his children view him, which is fascinating because this whole thing of the royals wanting to kind of change the world and make the world a better place and pursue social action was started by his father. King Charles got the ball rolling on all of this back in the 1970s when he launched a charity called the King's Trust, which, for what it's worth, has its 50th anniversary next year. It has the King's Trust International has its 10th anniversary this year. So Charles, at this moment, is gearing up for like a really big drive to kind of highlight this as his legacy. And the King's Trust was really the moment when he embarked on this journey towards making the monarchy an institution that could pursue social change in a way that it had never done before. Before that, the monarchy, they cut ribbons and they unveiled plaques, and that's what they did. It was all very low risk, but they did a lot of it. So then Charles came in and he pursued a much more socially conscious agenda, and got criticized for it a lot of the time. He really ate a backlash from the British press, like way back when, before Harry and William were even born. And then now he does loads and loads of engagements, and he's kind of a mix of these two worldviews. So he's inherited his mother's desire to just be constantly seen and therefore believed, but also pursuing social action. And William has come along, he's kind of taken the social action bit, but has decided he wants more impact. So he's doing far fewer engagements. There's much less plaque unveiling and ribbon cutting. But he's pursuing high impact, high reward projects. So a small number of high impact projects. So William doesn't really say what change he wants to bring in. And so I'm kind of torn in a way a little bit about this. So, regular listeners to the podcast will know that I pay huge amounts of attention to polling data, because basically all of our instinctive biases just guide us away from reality and towards inhabiting our fantasy version of what society is really like. And so one thing that started to show up in the polling is that young people are becoming more hostile towards monarchy. And that realistically is Prince William's job, Prince William's problem more than anybody else's, because in reality, it's a really slow moving crisis, and it probably won't fully blow up until William's reign, until after Charles's reign has come to an end in many, many years' time. This could be 15, 20 years down the line. And so the big question in terms of William and change is, what change does he want to bring in, and will it address any of those issues? And the trouble in Britain at the moment is that we're going through what's sometimes known as the anti-politics era. Like, people hate politicians. They hate like diplomatic language used by politicians. They hate the kind of the mild change that they don't see in their day-to-day lives, basically. And that tendency in the way that the public view the world at the moment is going to make it very difficult for William to have the impact that he's talking about. So if you take as a perfect case in point the Earthshot Prize, so this is one of William's biggest projects. Realistically, it will be a major part of the legacy he's building during this period when he's next in line to the throne. And he's giving out grants of £1 million each year to 5 different causes for innovative solutions to the climate crisis, and other associated, degradation of the sea and that kind of thing. And so, what he's trying to do there is he's trying to help people who already have ideas scale up those ideas into being bigger projects that can help us bit by bit chip away at our carbon emissions each year. Now, in terms of impact, he will be able to come away with saying, we helped, this project, and some of it is about stopping using plastic packaging in food and all of these things, and say, well, we backed this organization, this business, and they went on to achieve great things. But that's really, in a way, it's actually not so different to the legacy that the King's Trust has. And William is not going to single-handedly come up with, or alight on, or even with the help of anybody else, find the one single definitive solution to climate change. He's just not. He will help in an imperceptible way a whole bunch, 50 over the 10-year period that it runs, 50 projects that I'm sure are fantastic projects that will do wonders in their own small way. And ordinary people will not be able to see it in their day-to-day lives, even if they are holding a bit of food that they bought from the supermarket that's in a non-plastic packaging because of Prince William. They still won't necessarily know that they're doing it. And so he's going to, and he hasn't said in the interview that he thinks that, the change he brings in will save the monarchy's reputation among young people. He hasn't said that. But if he is, or if anyone in the palace is hoping that this pursuit of impact is going to change, is going to move the dial with young people, I think it's going to be really, really hard for William to change things in a way that is radical enough for it to register with that younger generation in the social media age. Now, none of this is me saying that he shouldn't have done this interview, or that the interview is bad, or that he shouldn't change things. He has every right to change things. He may well change them for the better. But I'm not seeing anything currently that I think will move the dial on that one crucial issue. But he did come across very well. I thought he came across as very personable in the interview. And, in that vein, I want to talk about a couple of the things he said. So he said that he talks about the insatiable appetite of the media when he was growing up. He says they wanted every bit of detail they could absorb, and they were in everything, literally everywhere. They would know things, they'd be everywhere. And if you let that creep in, the damage it can do to your family is something that I vowed would never happen to my family. So he's talking a little bit there about the efforts that he's made to try to have a different kind of relationship with the media. And he has, to some extent, been successful. He does have a different kind of relationship with the media, which has been built partially through negotiation. And he's taken a different approach to Harry, where he's not trying to kind of take on the media and defeat them and beat them. And it's not conflict driven. So I got the feeling from what William said that he wanted to land the point that whatever Harry might say about how terrible the media are, he thinks that they're not as bad now as they were when William and Harry were kids, when it was Diana, when it was phone hacking, when it was all of these things.
Catherine is in remission now.
Yes.
Yes,
Is, yeah.
which is wonderful.
It's great news, exactly.
How did that affect the children, if I may ask?
Everyone has their own coping mechanisms for these sorts of things, and children are constantly learning and adapting. We try to make sure we give them the security and the safety that they need. And we're a very open family, so we talk about things that bother us and things that trouble us. But you never quite know the knock-on effects it can have. And so it's just important to be there for each other and to kind of reassure the children that, you know, everything's okay.
He also said, as he said before, that he said, you know, 2023, 2024 was the hardest year I've ever had. You know, life is sent to test us, and being able to overcome that is what makes us who we are. So he's talking there predominantly about Kate's cancer diagnosis and Charles's too. So Kate is in remission officially. At the moment, Charles is not. Charles has a managed condition, which we're not necessarily expecting to go away anytime soon. And he also said he really missed. He was asked by Eugene Nivy, do you miss the Queen? And he said, I do actually. Yeah, I do miss my grandmother and grandfather. It's been quite a bit of change. So you think about them not being here anymore, and particularly being in Windsor. For me, Windsor is her. You know, is the Queen. She loved it here. She spent most of her time here. Showing you around today is very much a case of trying to make sure I'm doing it in the way she'd want you to see it. Welcome back to the show. Queen Camilla has paid tribute to the author Dame Jilly Cooper after her death was announced on Monday. She was 88. For those who don't know, Jilly Cooper is an iconic British fiction writer, and her books are just so much fun. So obviously dig out a copy of one of them, give it a read. Also, you know, for those who are less into literature, you can watch an adaptation of one of them, because the Netflix show Rivals was an adaptation of a Jilly Cooper novel, and it is a fantastic series for those who would rather have something to watch. But here, in the meantime, is what Camilla said in her statement. She said, I was so saddened to learn of Dame Jilly's death last night. Very few writers get to be a legend in their own lifetime, but Jilly was one, creating a whole new genre of literature and making it her own through a career that spanned over 5 decades. In person, she was a wonderfully witty and compassionate friend to me and so many, and it was a particular pleasure to see her just a few weeks ago at my Queen's Reading Room Festival, where she was, as ever, a star of the show. I join my husband, the King, in sending our thoughts and sympathies to all her family, and may her hereafter be filled with impossibly handsome men and devoted dogs. And that's it for this episode of The Royal Report. Be sure to join me every week when I visit the latest royal headlines, embark on some royal deep dives, and riff on all things royal. Until next time, thanks for listening, everyone, and a curtsy to you all.